Good morning again, everyone. My name is Barbara Griffin. This is the New Hampshire House Special Committee on Redistricting. Today is September 30th, and so we know who's here and how we go forward. I'm going to ask the clerk, Representative McDonald, to call the roll.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Representative Bergeron.
Present.
Representative Barry.
Here.
Representative Simpson for Representative Cody.
Present.
Representative Griffin.
Present.
Representative Lane.
Present.
Representative Lynn.
Here.
Representative McDonald is present. Representative McGuire.
Here.
Representative Alexander for Representative O'Hara.
Here.
Representative Piedra.
Here.
Representative Marjorie Smith.
Here.
Representative Stephen Smith.
Here.
Representative Turcott.
Here.
Representative Weber.
Here.
Representative Wilhelm.
Here.
15 in attendance, Madam Chairman.
Thank you.
Madam Chair?
Sure. Representative Weber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As a preliminary matter, I just want to note that we were told that all safety precautions were being taken when we meet in this building, and that included rooms scheduled so that we could do appropriate distancing, yet here we all are still sitting very much too close to each other, and I would hope that at future meetings, the room arrangement would reflect a more appropriate disposition. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment, Representative Weber. The handy thing about our nameplates is that they can move, so can members. So if someone feels that if they're not sitting in an appropriate place, feel free to move your nameplate to a different spot on the table. The mics look like they have plenty of cord to be moved around to accommodate your personal request, which we're always happy to try and meet. The first thing on the agenda is I'm looking for any comments from members on how it's going with the program. We passed out a thumb drive with a program that had two different programs on it, so to speak, and I use the wrong terminology with computer things, for House districts and congressional districts. I know some of us have spent some very frustrating evenings working on it, and I just wanted to sort of get some feedback on how people are doing, because at some point we need to start talking about actual maps. Representative McGuire, did I see your hand?
Yes, Madam Chair. I've been working mostly on the House districts and specifically in Merrimack County. The program works very nicely, but with the Concord wards varying by a rep and a half, by about 1,500 people, I can't come up with a complete map, because Concord cannot be isolated from the rest of the county. Franklin,
They're probably glad to hear that.
yes, well, they're part of the county. We've got to deal with it. There are sections of my map that I'm quite happy with. There are others that I am not, and I really need Concord in order to balance it. Was on.
I have a hard time telling whether these buttons are down or up, or what the schematic is. But
Is that
I
on?
just got a text saying hearing no sound.
Okay.
Which is why I pointed to the...
Okay.
Well, I think this meeting is going to be fraught with
Is that
eyesight
down?
issues for me.
Can
Yes,
you
now
hear me?
I can hear a
Thank you.
little
Sorry
echo.
about that. So I'll repeat. I've been working on the county maps, and particularly Merrimack County, and I can't get very far without having proper wards in Concord. The county commissioners for Merrimack are are exactly 15 reps each, so I've got two different plans that I'm happy with for county commissioners in Merrimack. And I've been working on the other counties occasionally. From Grafton County, it's easy enough to get small compact districts. It is very difficult to give each town its own rep because of all the tiny towns that are around the mall and maintaining the variances.
Thank you for sharing your experience with trying to work on the program. Does anybody else have anything to add on it? Representative Weber.
I'll just state that I don't have anything to add yet because I have as yet to buy the piece of equipment that will allow the thumb drive to connect to my computer. But as we've only had 3 of the listening sessions, I will be working on that.
Okay,
I also have just had a further message that there is still no sound for those who are trying to view.
all right. Is somebody from House watching that? Somebody is getting a text that there is no sound. Can somebody, Christina Dyer from the legislative office, says that the sound is working? Okay, we're double checking right now. There's something in every meeting when there are electronics involved as to what works and what doesn't work. It's somewhat astounding. I know that there was someone outside in the hall from tech services a few minutes ago, so I'm presuming it started all right. So I don't know what's happened in the meantime. We're going to pause for a minute until we get straightened out on the sound, given that we are live streaming this. This is also being recorded. So the sound is up and running. I suspect some of this has to do with member volume and how close the microphone is to us. There's a difference between amplification and recording, and we need to be mindful of it, and I apologize. Representative Weber, thank you for giving us that update. I do know that I have had a representative tell me that this is not an exercise you want to do a half an hour before you're going to bed because it just gets you completely riled up. Anybody else? Representative Bergeron.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would just note that the software, the program that was developed 10 years ago isn't compatible with Apple. So those of us that have Apple computers are having a bear of a time making it work. I don't know if IT could convert it to an Apple-friendly program or not, but I would welcome that if it can be done.
As would I.
The other thing that perhaps we can ask IT about if somebody wants to take the program and take it from a thumb drive to put it on a DVR or something like that, that their computer might read, I'm sure we can provide that service also. Anybody else on the actual mapping? Thank you. Representative McGuire referenced county commissioners. We're sort of focused on the House because that is who we are right here, but county commissioners will need to be done in every county. That program has been done. My apologies, we didn't have thumb drives or perhaps other drives available for everybody, but we will get that to you so that you can work on that piece. Every county has districts for county commissioners except Stratford. Is that correct, Representative Turcotte?
That is correct.
Okay. So Stratford is currently at large. Everybody else has districts, so that is going to be a slightly different formulation for you to work on, and we'll get that to you. The next thing on the agenda is something that was brought to my attention by perusal of LSRs. Legislative service requests for 2022 have been filed. And if you look at them, you will note that there is one for a constitutional amendment dealing with the number of representatives and the number of senators. And it occurred to me that while we had looked at the constitutional requirements for redistricting and voted on it, such as county lines, we had not actually discussed the number of representatives, which by constitution can be 375 to 400. So with that in mind, I asked Representative Ross, who had done the county allocation previously that we had looked at and adopted in regards to county numbers, to take a look at what would happen if we varied the number of reps as is permitted by Constitution. The committee members received, and this will go online, a spreadsheet of what happens with the county breakouts for representatives if we go from the 375 to 400. Part of the reason this discussion is important is because there is a need to allocate representatives proportionately within certain numerical standards. And if you start off with a formula that already is not balanced, it makes subsequent work to balance things within your percentage of deviation more difficult, which is why we're seeing sort of some fluctuations in representatives for county from 2010 to 2020 that are not apparent by the gross numbers. So Representative Barry, excuse me for, I think I referred to you as Representative Ross. Representative Barry, if you could explain this sheet that I can read if it's very close to my face.
Yes, Madam Chairman, thank you. It's very small because there's 25 permutations for 10 counties. So there's 250 pieces of data that you start with when you're looking at equal, or and I don't want to say equal, but proportioning by county. So to kind of walk the committee through the sheet, the very first, we'll call it section of data that you'll see, which has the county names. The first number you'll see to the right of those county names is their total population, right? That's not up for debate. And then you'll see at the top of that a new row in bold, which has 400, 399, 398, going down all the way to 375. And it shows you what the perfect allocation would be per county if that number of representatives was instituted. So we obviously know what 400 is because we've been doing all of our math based off of that, but it goes all the way down there. And then underneath that, you'll see very similar to the sheet that was distributed, I believe, in our second meeting, maybe our third, where I've rounded them down. So using perfect rounding, right? So if it's 18.49, it goes to 18. If it's 18.51, it goes to 19. And you can see what that is per county going down. The one underneath that is the one with all the pretty colors. This is how far away they are from zero. So let's take Belknap County in the 400. If we had 400 state representatives, they would be allocated 18.49834, right? So basically what we're doing is we're chopping off the 18 and we're saying, all right, well, they're 0.49 off from zero. Conversely, if they were high, right, so Carroll County is high, 14.54, you'll see that underneath there, they're at 0.45, right? So it's because it's easier for them to go up than it is for go down, right? So we're looking at the difference to zero, right? Whatever the closest next whole number is, if you will. So that's how far they're off. So the reason that they're color coded is obviously we want to be as close to the nearest whole number as possible, right? Because that's the most even proportional representation possible. Obviously, there's no perfect solution, but I wanted to present to the committee what that looks like. So red is bad, green is good, and yellow is in the middle. So you could see 400
I
is
just
not...
want to thank you for not picking red and blue.
So you can see that 400 is not ideal, but that's what we've traditionally had. If I'll point out to 391 again, because 391 happens to be the best. Well, the best by the standard of perfect distribution or near perfect distribution. Underneath that, you'll see one more set of data, and this is the this is the average, median, standard deviation, and largest deviation. So the average, remember, this is how far they are from perfect, right? So this is all 10 counties collectively how far away they are. It's not a perfect way of looking at this because the counties are obviously not all the same population, but we set that in as a boundary already. So we're kind of already working. Every time we set a new standard, we're moving farther away from the quote-unquote perfect ideal, right? The 3443 or 3444. So underneath that is the median. If you're going back to your 5th, 6th, or 7th grade math class, that's going to be the The number that if you line them all up, the one that's closest to the middle, the standard deviation. So the standard deviation, this is a statistical term. It's basically their distribution. So the standard deviation is not from zero. The standard deviation is from their average. But what the standard deviation does is it lets you know how far away they are separated from each other, right? So in an ideal world, we'd want them to all be equally as off, right? Because we're already dealing with an imperfect world. And then the largest deviation, that one's not rocket science, that is which county has the farthest away from the ideal. So once again, Belknap County did me a huge favor by being the BEL and in 400. So if you look at them, they're 0.49834. There's really no other way to be farther away from zero than 0.49834. So you'll see they are the largest deviation, and that changes. I don't have which counties labeled for that, but that just kind of shows you how far off. So you can look at 400, you can look at it all the way down to 375. I point out 391 because it kind of actually is the best looking. You have two other sheets with you that are not in pretty colors. But all this is the data broken out into a line graph and a bar chart. So the line graph is the easiest one to kind of look at and get a fast assessment of the distribution by number. And that's where 391, you can really just look at it. Lower is better, right? We want that number as close to zero as possible. So you can see 391 is very nice, but so that is that massive amounts of sheet in very, very small print that you have in front of you, and I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has about it.
Any questions on the data? Representative Fedora?
Thank you, Representative, for doing this. It's very interesting, and I'm impressed, so thank you. As a lawyer, I'm sure the lawyers on the committee can agree. We're not as good with numbers. Can you explain to me, so for example, we're looking at a 391, which you mentioned has the least, I guess, deviation from the perfect proportion. So what is the benefit of that from a mapping standpoint?
I don't think I can answer that question from a mapping standpoint. I'm thinking it more of as a representation inside the. I guess the answer to that would be it would be easier to draw the maps at that level, but that doesn't mean that we should. We've had 400 for quite some time. I'm not advocating that we move to 391, but I think the committee needs to look at it and eventually make a decision.
Representative Turcott.
Very impressive, Representative Barry. Would it be fair to say that what this might represent is the most closest to perfect allocation of reps per county? Isn't that
correct?
the way
Because we believe we cannot count cross county lines because the state representatives make up the county delegation. We're already dealing with an imperfect system right off the bat. We're not like other states where state representative districts. I'm not aware of another state where a state representative district cannot cross a county line. I could be mistaken in that, so don't hold me to that, but I'm not aware of one. But because we operate under that equal protection, one man, one vote principle that's assigned with county government, we are already operating underneath I don't want to say flawed, but less than perfect system to begin with.
Representative Wilhelm.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Barry, I'm curious if going to 391 representatives, does it actually make it easier for us to map within each county?
In theory, it would, because you would be dealing with. Remember, because we're still, even when we go into a side of a county, like, so with 400, we know it's 3444. I think it's 3.44438 to be somewhat close. But so you would, in theory, be getting be a little easier to draw the maps, because you would have less deviation from the perfect to begin with, right? So you're not starting as far out from zero, or in reality. And remember, this is to zero, right? So I didn't go through and program it to be 0.05 and negative 0.05, right? Which I could have done, which you can excuse me, you can still do the math, right? Everything just comes down 0.05. I guess my assumption would be that it would. I didn't look at it from that. I was just looking at it from a, what is the representative? It was purely for me a statistical study of what does it look like if we do what is allowed via our our laws. Oh, good Lord, which is 375 to 400.
Representative Weber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I'm remembering from last time that I come from a county that was entitled to 23.48 representatives, and of course that got rounded down to 23. And I will say that it does actually make a difference when you try and come to do the mapping, because the deviations are already skewed. And I remember coming up with a map that would have worked really, really well if only we changed Dublin and gave it to Hillsborough County. And Dublin was about 1,500, which was just about half of one representative. But that didn't happen. So on a purely mathematical level, I think it would be better. I wonder what the response is from people for whom this will mean significant disruption in what they think of as the status quo and what they like in the places that they like it. I know that there are places where they don't like it, but I'm not sure how the going from 3,000, what was it, 445 or so to 3,523. It's not something that should make a difference, but it may make a difference, and I don't know what kind of difference it makes, and I certainly, before we go too far down this road and start redoing map-making software and things like that, I'd sure like an opportunity to hear from the public about their thoughts about it. I do know that we had testimony from one member of the public who suggested that 375 would be a better iteration than 400, but I don't think he took into account all the other ones in between. So I thank the representative very much for his comprehensive work.
If members want to turn to Representative Smith, Steve Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thanks for that work, Ross. It is good to see, but I think it's highlighting the difficulty of the job we have, because I don't think it should be a goal of this committee to provide people with less representation in the interests of mathematical efficacy. I'd rather do the hard work right now of doing that, because if that is what we cared about, you could probably get really good numbers by going to each county, find a town or municipality that's within a reasonable deviation of perfect population, give them their own rep or reps, make the rest of the county one at-large district, and be done with it. And I don't think that's what anybody wants. So for me, the number's 400. I don't want to give New Hampshire people less representatives than that, and I'm willing to have my eyes bleed to try to facilitate it.
Thank you. In regards to this issue, this has obviously been an issue that's come before the House before. You have in front of you 2 memos that have been provided to the committee that will be placed online in regards to how has the Constitution changed in regards to this issue to its current date, and what, if any, efforts have been made to change the numbers. There is an interesting history that goes through the 1784 Constitution, which actually was intended to fix what was being done without a constitution, and then there have been 4 amendments since then of interest, probably in line with what members have said are proposals to reduce the size of the house. Quite frankly, I had no idea that there were this many attempts to change the number until staff had put it together. That started in 1969, and there have been 5, 10, 15, at least 20 proposals, including 4 since 2000, to change the size of representatives. So all of them have been defeated in the House by a voice vote. And so I think I probably share the sentiments of everybody who has spoken here. But once again, I think perhaps I thought something that was good to consider, but I'm not sure it makes sense to implement it in this process. So, Representative Turcott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Similar to Representative Steve Smith, I'm not sure the potential for ease of mapping, which I'll speak to on my second point, would outweigh the changing of the number from 400 down to any number less than 400. I think there's the redistricting process is filled with enough landmines that we don't probably need to add too many more in there, and I think this would be one of them. Having spent many hours, and as you mentioned before, don't anybody do it after about 7 or 8 at night, because you will be up all night thinking about it. But I'm not necessarily sure that changing the number would actually make the mapping of, at least in the House of Representatives, any simpler. Where we're doing it county by county, yeah, we may have a large deviation, say for Belknap in that first square where it's .498, but you can still, I believe, map the county with equal deviations within the county. So I'm not so sure, although I do like, when you look at 391, I mean, the color mapping does show you that, in fact, that on a county basis, reps per county, it is more beneficial. I don't think actually in terms of mapping individual counties, and that's pretty much all I've been doing, I'm not so sure that'll make a difference. So I would say to attempt to change the number down from 400 at this point would probably not be in our best interest.
Representative Steve Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's worth noting when you mentioned that it was defeated in the House through multiple administrations going back decades on a voice vote, that the only way that could have happened was if the motion came to the floor ITL. So not only was it defeated, it came out of committee with a recommendation of inexpedient to legislate. On these 2 pages, I counted 19 times.
Representative Weber.
I just want to make it clear that we're talking about apples and oranges here. The impressive research about all the other attempts to change the size of the House are constitutional amendments that would lower the number significantly below the currently permitted 375 to 400. Whereas what I think we're discussing today is not a constitutional amendment to lower the House numbers beyond 375, but to pick a number between 375 and 400, which we're currently allowed to do. I don't think that that necessarily means it would be any more popular. I just want to point out that if we're using the constitutional amendments as a point of reference for why we should or shouldn't do this, it's not the same animal.
Thank you, Representative Weber, for pointing out that distinction. And just so the public is aware, we're apparently also defeating moves to either pay us or remove the $100 at the same time. So it's been quite the history. Representative Lane. Oh, Representative Marjorie Smith. Okay.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I particularly want to thank you for initiating this research. with the committee researcher, I always get hung up on policy. That's what I care about, and I found it fascinating to read that history. It occurs to me that this committee is facing a series of obstacles that we have no real control over at this point. And I would hope that we might use this conversation and this research as an opportunity to open a discussion that's not going to affect what we do in terms of our allocation this time, but might put in play something that could make this system work to the benefit of all the citizens of the state, so that I could see us considering the constitutional questions of saying that we should not be limited by county boundaries. That would make tremendous change in this state, and change that I think might be for the good, but it might not be if we look at it in terms of changing how we structure county government so that we are no longer the legislative body of the county government. All of that is fascinating policy, but today it seems to me that we can't negotiate those changes in any way that is fair to the citizens of the state. And I do like the fact that it's almost October and this chart shows us beautiful fall colors. I immediately went to 391 because I could see the greens and the yellows. I realized that 4 out of the 10 counties wouldn't change at all, but that leaves 6. One would change by 3, 1 by 2, the rest by 1. That is a major change, and I think we're going to have enough slings and arrows focused on us not to have people have other reasons to challenge the appropriateness of what we're doing. And I hope the issue doesn't go away. I hope we pay attention to it. It might require constitutional amendments. It might require legislative change, but not today.
Thank you, Representative Lane.
Thank you, and again, thank you for this research. I would never in a million years been able to do it on my own. I guess my question is, piggybacks a little bit on Representative Smith's, which was, what was the purpose when they put in the 375 to 400? Why did they do that? And I don't think these memos really address that. So, you know, from my viewpoint, what was the legislative intent of giving that gap if it's not to consider it in this room?
I guess, Representative Lane, I can't remember what the legislative intent was last year, and I wasn't around back then, so I would hate to deem to guess what the legislative intent was.
Okay, I mean, I just wonder if there's as follow-up?
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering why put it in there if it's not to take it into consideration when we're sitting here trying to do redistricting?
I understand your question, and I think if you look at the history of the amendments, you might be able to make an educated guess, but I suspect maybe that will be a question that whoever gets the LSR proposing a rather significant change in the number of representatives and senators will have to grapple with. I think I agree with the statement of many. It's probably not a subject for us to discuss. Any other comments on this? All right, well, given that we have adopted some standards for complying with the constitutional guidelines for redistricting, I would ask someone for a motion in regards to complying with the constitutional guidelines in regards to the number of representatives that we will be using for drawing the maps for the House of Representatives in New Hampshire. Representative Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that for the purposes of the 2020 redistricting, the House of Representatives number be set at 400.
Is there a second?
Second.
Seconds. Is there any further discussion? Representative Marjorie Smith.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Could I ask why you believe the motion is necessary? since the status quo is 400, we are functioning within the existing parameters. Why would we need to have a motion on this at this point? And I ask that because there are other points that have been made quite eloquently, I think, in the three listening sessions that we've been able to schedule so far, where, for example, school districts seem to make a lot of sense to pay attention to school districts and drawing lines.
Thank you, Representative Smith, for your comments. I think that there's a difference between constitutional issues and issues in regards to what some people might say is pertinent in discussions regarding the determination of ward lines. Additionally, this committee has already taken votes on certain constitutional provisions. So given that the question arose in my mind, there's an LSR coming, and I suspect this might be a discussion in the future, I bring it forward to the committee for a vote. Representative Turcott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To specifically to Representative Marjorie Smith's comment, I think the reason for this is for those of us who are spending inordinate amounts of time doing the mapping, it would be very helpful going forward to know if we're going to be using the number 400, the number 375, the number 391, or whatever. We have some other issues coming up later in this meeting that are similar. To spin wheels attempting to map counties when you don't know if that's the number you're going to be using is a waste of time. So this is a way to nail down a number so we can actually move forward with the mapping process for those of us who are actually doing it.
Thank you, Representative Steve Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think the motion's necessary because we're permitted to do 375 to 400. From a procedural standpoint, I don't want to be a week or two from the finish line and then have to consider maps based on another number. But most importantly, transparency is the word of the day, and we should tell the public straight up what criteria we're using, and that's why I made the motion.
Representative Barry.
Yes, Madam Chairman, I will be voting to keep the representation at 400 based largely on what the committee has said today, and not to speak for Representative Marjorie Smith, but I believe this is already going to be a complicated enough process as it is. It already has enough pitfalls in front of us and points of potential failure that I think adding another one would be foolish for the committee. And it will make life a little more difficult on the drawing point, but I think in terms of getting maps out that represent the people quickly, that keeping it as it is right now is probably in the committee's best interest.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion on the motion? Representative Weber.
I just want to be sure that we're not foreclosing something that we might find later on might be useful. Am I right in thinking, Madam Chair, that if somebody provides us with a map that looks really very good in terms of all of the parameters that we've been hearing about from the people who have come to our listening sessions, and it turned out that that map was at 391 or 375 or a different number, could we not then vote to change our minds and accept that? Or, I mean, are our votes here cast in stone at this point?
I think the three-page memo shows that nothing's cast in stone. Procedure is always subject to motions to reconsider.
Thank you.
Representative McGuire.
Yes, thank you. One point is that the more representatives we have, the smaller the towns that would be entitled to get their own, and that's something that a lot of people devoutly wish, even if it's not possible because of the deviations in the size of towns, it's still a goal.
Thank you. Any further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'm going to ask the clerk to call the roll.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Representative Stephen Smith.
Yes.
Representative McGuire.
Yes.
Representative Turcott.
Yes.
Representative McDonald votes yes. Representative Lynn,
Yes.
Representative Berry,
Yes.
Representative Alexander,
Yes.
Representative Simpson,
Yes.
Representative Marjorie Smith, Representative Bergeron, Representative Lane, Representative Piedra,
Yes.
Representative Weber,
Yes.
Representative Wilhelm,
Yes.
Representative Griffin.
Yes.
Unanimous, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, committee members. The next item on the agenda, subject to the need for further spell check on my computer, is a discussion on the methodology to be presented to the committee by David Andrews from Open Democracy Action. I have asked Mr. Andrews to come here today. Mr. Andrews, if you want to come up to the table. Mr. Andrews and I are almost on first name basis now. He has been a trooper and spoken at every public input session. By the end of this, I will know what his favorite color is and maybe what he likes for lunch. Some of us are aware of something called the Mapathon Project, which has been working on maps, two of which were presented at a public input session last week. And so in the interest of having a discussion on the methodology that we have been seeing every week, I recall that Mr. Andrews gave an explanation at the first public input session in Merrimack, which supplemented a submission you have all received by email in regards to the methodology, and I thought that his explanation was helpful to me. I am not quite as good with numbers as some of us are, obviously, so I asked Mr. Andrews to come today, and he has graciously agreed. So to come here to talk about the methodology that he's using, and he has provided, I'm assuming these are from you, on my table. I asked him to bring things if he wanted us to refer to him. So with that, I will welcome Mr. Andrews. Thank you for coming this morning and adjusting your schedule.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So just very quickly, I've been doing a lot of different mapping, whether it be congressional down to the New Hampshire House, and I understand the struggles that you are having, especially with the New Hampshire House and the difficulties of it with the constraints that are put forth onto it. And one of those constraints is the method of calculating floterials. And so when I had started the process, I was looking at the 2010 maps, and I was trying to give more towns their own districts. And I was struggling, and I was only able to come up with a few here or there. And so what I thought that maybe there was a better way to calculate floterials and thus allow for more towns that have the enough population to have their own districts. So what I did was I used a variation of the current method that is done. So first, I just wanted to go over a quick history of the floterial because it puts it a little bit in context. So in 2000, maps were drawn using what is called the aggregate method, which is what most people assume floterials are calculated with. It's kind of, you take the extra people from two different districts and you make a floterial out of it. If all the districts add up to within 5% of the deviation, it's good to go. But in 2002, the maps were challenged in the New Hampshire Supreme Court in Burling v. Chandler. And in that ruling, the New Hampshire Supreme Court ruled that you could not use the aggregate method in order to calculate floterials, because if, say, one town gives only 100 people to the floterial and the other town gives 3,000, it's not very fair to the one person, one vote rule. So what the New Hampshire Supreme Court said was that you need to factor in that floterial deviation. And what they did was they proposed a method called the component method, which I'll talk about in more detail. So they ruled that the aggregate method was unconstitutional based on the one person, one vote rule, and they proposed the component method as a way that you could calculate floterials, but they didn't rule out anything else. So that's kind of where my method comes into account. So in 2010, the component method was used. This is the same method that is used in your program to calculate floterials. But in 2010, 62 towns that were eligible for their own district were not allowed, mostly because of the constraints of this component method. So first off, if you want to look at it's the handout with the New Hampshire House map on it, and I'm on page 3, which is the aggregate method. And I kind of explained it already. It was ruled unconstitutional, so I'm not going to get into too much of it, but it's really just you add up everybody from the districts, divide by the ideal population, and if that's within plus or minus 5%, then it's good to go. But again, it doesn't factor in the floterial deviation into its calculation. So if we go on to the component method, which is the current method that's used, it's a bit of a complex equation, as you can see, but in essence, what it does is it weighs the extra people from each district, and then tries to make sure that those two populations are pretty equal, and that's what that kind of equation is really doing. So I give an example on the next page. So if there's a district with 5,000 people, a district with 4,000 people, if you run that through the component method, it comes up with the deviation for the floterial seat as 7.11 for District A and negative 7.66 for District B. So in this case, it would not be allowed to be a floterial district, even though I think intuitively it would make sense to, allow for that. So what I thought was, so the one thing that the component method doesn't take into account, which my alternative component method does, is the deviation of the non-floterial seats. So in being able to factor in the plus or minus 5% deviation in not only the floterial seat, but the other non-floterial seats as well, it allows for just a little bit of extra wiggle room, or just to allow for more possibilities in the mapping process. So again, you can see in the next example, I use the same populations for the districts, and with using the alternative component method, you can see that it's actually allowed to be a floterial district in this example. So it really it does allow for a little bit more wiggle room in districting, but it's not as flexible as the aggregate method is. And so you can see in the next example, if we just move 250 people from one district to the other, then the alternative component method no longer works for that. So it's not just as flexible as possible. There is some still constraints on it, and it still follows the New Hampshire Supreme Court's idea that the floterial district deviation should be calculated in the mapping process. So if you look at the next page, this is the real kind of important point of this. So I've drawn maps for all of the different counties in New Hampshire for the House, and I'm not saying they're the best ones out there. I'm sure that they can be approved of, but I spent many hours doing this, and this was the best that I could come up with on my own. So you can see that just using the regular component method, I had 67 cases where towns that should have their own districts were not able to, 7 of which are kind of necessary. One is the fault of my own town, Chichester, because it's surrounded by larger towns, so it needs to be combined with somebody. So that's the case for those 7 necessary violations. So 60 unnecessary violations in maps that I drew that with the component method. But you can see that with the alternative component method, it allows for just that little bit of extra wiggle room, and so I was able to get it down to 19 unnecessary violations. So really 41 extra towns were able to be given their own districts, and thus I think follow the Constitution a lot better. And you can see I give 2 examples. One is Merrimack County. You can see that there's 10 violations in the above map, and then only 2 which are both necessary violations because of Chichester and Canterbury and Dunbarton. So it really just allows for that little bit of extra wiggle room to have districts that I think work better to follow the New Hampshire Constitution. And then again, Hillsborough is the same kind of case, but it's not perfect. So there's, I believe, 11 with the component method and 3 with the alternative component method, which was the best that I could do, but it's still, it's still not perfect. But I think that this way would be a better way to be able to give those towns their own districts and thus their own representatives.
So, Mr. Andrews, this is the methodology that was used for the maps that were presented at the public input session on last week.
I believe so, yes. We had a map of each. So we've done a map with the component method versus a map with the alternative component method.
Okay, and at the public input sessions, we've discussed the fact that there is available a website for this committee. That website has links for providing direct written comment and including uploading of certain material. I have not looked at it in the last 24 hours, I will admit, but some maps have been uploaded, so you understand that the potential is there for the actual input of maps.
Yes.
Okay. All right. And do you know whether this methodology has ever been discussed or used before?
I believe I am the first person to come up with it, so.
Okay. Questions for Mr. Andrews? Representative Lane.
Again, thank you. Could you just clarify a little bit more about what a necessary versus an unnecessary violation is? Just
Sure,
to
yeah.
clarify. Yeah.
Yeah, so in the case of my town of Chichester, it's surrounded by Pembroke, Epsom, Pittsfield, and Loudon, all of which are over the 3,444. And therefore, all those towns should get their own representative and district. But since Chichester is too small to have its own, it would need to be combined with one of those other towns. And so the New Hampshire Constitution says that towns shall have their own district if possible, but it shall not interfere with other towns being in one non-floterial district. So you couldn't have a town, Pembroke couldn't have its own district and then a floterial with just Chichester, because Chichester would need its own non-floterial district, which is why Pembroke and Chichester are combined into one district.
Other questions? Representative Barry.
Thank you for putting all. I know that you've put a lot of work into this. It's apparent.
It's also apparent to me I should have labeled this working session algebra, 201, because we're way beyond 101.
Makes my Excel sheet look amateurish. Is there any legal court standing on this? Has it ever been tried in court anywhere? I know we have a unique system in New Hampshire, but do we have any sort of legal backing for this process?
I don't believe that this has been brought before any court. The New Hampshire Supreme Court is the one that put forth the component method as a method that would work for calculating floterials, but they really emphasize the point that floterial deviation should be factored in. So if you go through and read the Burling v. Chandler, it emphasizes the fact that the aggregate method doesn't factor in floterial deviation at all, and then talks about how you need to factor in the floterial deviation. And the alternative component method does factor in floterial deviation. It just also factors in the deviation of the non-floterial districts.
Representative Turcott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your presentation. On the second, I guess it'd be the second to last page of what we just went over, where you have the necessary violations and unnecessarily. I would have liked to have seen a column at the end of that that kind of outlined the maximum deviations, because from my reading of this, I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity, redistricting law, there's an obvious, I guess what we could call a tension between U.S. constitutional law and New Hampshire constitutional law as regarding deviations. I'm assuming that under your alternative component method that the maximum deviations, even though they're what you call necessary and unnecessary violations, are reduced, that the maximum deviations far exceed what other constitutional law may prohibit.
So with all of these, I used the plus or minus 5% deviation, which is, I think, generally accepted by courts around the country as acceptable deviation. And so both the component method and the alternative component method use that same plus or minus 5%. It's just that the alternative component method also factors in the deviation of the non-floterial districts, and in doing so allows for that little extra wiggle room.
Other questions? Representative Smith. Steve Smith.
Thank you. So I was looking at the Hillsborough maps that you have here. It looks like you create a lot more and larger floterials. And then I flip back a page, and on Merrimack, under your method, that is a big honking floterial on the top left. So is that what happens to make the math come out right? You have to just create way bigger districts?
It's so what it kind of does is it reduces the overall size of the in general, the regular districts, but the floterials are generally a bit larger.
I'm sorry, I'm writing. Representative Weber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. But isn't it also possible, because I'm looking at my own county, and there isn't a map with it, but in my own county, what you've stated is that we go to 0 violations. But as my county stands now, although we don't have huge floterial districts, my own district is 4 towns, 3 representatives, 3 towns that should have had their own representative, and to get from one end to the other, you go through the next state if you want to go quickly. So is it not possible that the large floterials versus large underlying district may be specific county to county and not necessarily endemic to this particular program?
I was just speaking in generality. Some do. The real thing is that it's a trade-off in that you get larger floterials, but the other districts are a lot smaller. So it actually allows. So yes, you break up. You give towns that have the sufficient population their own districts, but then also the smaller towns can be put together more compactly, and then you would have a overlying floterial district there. But it does allow for more kind of compact non-floterial districts, but then larger kind of floterial districts.
Representative Weber.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for taking my follow-up. So would it be possible for you to perhaps produce and send to us a comparison of how many representatives are in the underlying district in your iteration versus how many representatives represent floterials? And perhaps a comparison to that, to the status quo. We can always find that in any case, that doesn't matter. But for myself, that chart would be very helpful because large floterials, as we have heard, are not very helpful to people. But if the trade-off were a lot more smaller and local districts, I think that a lot more people might feel differently about the large floterials. And as you say, it's a trade-off, but it would be lovely to see the numbers on that if you could generate them without too much difficulty.
Yeah, I can send those.
Other questions? Mr. Andrews, going to the comparison between the methodology on your numerical column page, could you please tell me what you consider a violation is, and then your ranking of what a necessary violation is?
Yep. So just a violation would be a town that has 3,444 or over that I was not able to give its own district, and then again, the necessary violations are just ones that you are going to violate the Constitution one way or the other when you do it. Either a town doesn't get its own district that should, or a town doesn't get a non-floterial district.
Thank you. Other questions? I'm giving people a minute to look. I see some glazed eyes.
May I?
Sure.
Can I just want to make
Representative
sure
Knight.
that I'm understanding what, am I understanding that when you say that your alternative method takes into consideration the deviations in the non-floterial districts, am I understanding that, just to sort of use simple examples, if, let's say that the ideal district was 3,000 as opposed to something more than, just to make it easy. So you would say, if I'm understanding correctly, that, well, if a town has, let's say, a population of 4,000 people, we could, instead of saying that the population, if you will, that would be assigned to the floterial is 1,000, we could actually, because a 5% deviation is allowed, we could say, instead of saying that the underlying district, the non-floterial district will consist of 3,000 people, we can make it 3,000 minus 5%, and then assign those extra numbers to the floterial. Is that
exactly
correct?
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
that's exactly correct.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other further questions for Mr. Andrews? Every time you tell me about it, I think I understand it, and then I think about it later in the day, and I don't understand it anymore.
Everyone tells me that.
Okay. Mr. Andrews, you've also given us another handout of the project itself, which is not really completely relevant to what we're here on the agenda for. If you want to submit that online through the upload provisions, button click on the website, please go ahead, and that way it will be on there for information. And thank you for providing it to the committee members. Any other questions for Mr. Andrews, who I want to thank for coming and arranging this? I'm sure that you'd be happy to have people reach out to you if they have questions on what you've presented. I certainly really appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you at a public input session.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. Okay, so to continue the math of the day, We have to deal with representatives and cities as we move forward. Representative Bergeron has kindly provided us with another update of the status. So if he just wants to run through that, but I think we can, for purposes of the discussion we're about to hear, understand that cities are not going to have things set until, in general, January, which will be over a month after we have a bill to report out of this committee. So Representative Bergeron.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I think the Chair summarized pretty much the position that we are in. Rochester appears to be the only community, the only city in the state that may have its ward lines done before November 18th. They're on track to take a vote on November 3rd. All the other cities, it will occur after their city elections this fall. Some have to go through a charter amendment process and may or may not choose to do so. I haven't heard yet what Claremont's intent is. Some cities like Dover and Keene are trying to amend their charter in the November election to allow them then to do redistricting by ordinance. If that question fails in one or both of the cities, they then have to start the whole charter amendment process in order to redo their lines. For purposes of redistricting, I mean, we could make the assumption that all the cities are going to do it and they're going to do it correctly, and there'll be a very small deviation when it's done, but it's a risky assumption to make. As we're working with maps, some cities might be able to stand alone on their own, if you will, within their own boundaries for all the reps they might be entitled to. For example, Concord has 10 wards. They may be entitled to 13 state representatives. They could theoretically elect one from each ward and then 3 citywide. But it may be that neighboring towns need to pair up with the ward in Concord in order to make their numbers work. So I don't have a suggestion or any thoughts on this other than to say that the cities are not going to have the numbers you need prior to November 18th.
Representative Weber.
Thank you. I just had one quick question about the city of, oh, never mind, I'm sorry, I misread the chart, so I don't have a question at all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Questions or comments?
Yes, Madam Chairman.
Representative Berry.
Yes, the city ward lines, from what I've seen, is that some of these cities are off by a lot. I know in my home city.
You mean with the current
with
number?
the current ward lines. I know in my city of Manchester, Ward 12, which is our most northwesterly ward, has over 10,000 people now. And there's another ward, and it's escaping me right now, has barely over 9,000. And that's a massive deviation. It makes it to where when you're drawing lines, it's actually hard to represent the wards and the city as a whole because they're not equal within each other. One of the wards in Manchester would qualify for its own, while others would have to be in a float. These cities have to get on this. They have to do this, and they need to draw these lines as nearly perfect as possible. It makes our job a lot easier when they do that. But they need to get moving, and I don't know, but I think we need to. I want to say thank you to Representative Bergeron, but for all of his hard work, this is a massive undertaking. But I think we have to let these cities know that they need to get going.
Madam Chair, if I may.
Representative Bergeron.
I would just clarify that a number of the cities were waiting to the release of the new data files on September 30th, which actually just came out a few days ago. They wanted to be sure that they had software or materials and data files that they could work with effectively. Manchester 10 years ago, for example, did their redistricting down to the neighborhood level. You have series of you have a census tract, a census block, and then neighborhood levels, and they were able to keep their range of deviation within 1%. I believe Dover did about the same thing. So they wanted to make sure that the files that we're getting were usable, and they found that the ones that were released earlier left a lot to be desired. So they understand their need. It's just that their timelines are different than ours in terms of data release, charter amendment processes and timelines, and there's just a lot that they're dealing with as well.
Representative McGuire.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to reiterate what Representative Berry said. Looking at Concord, you can't even assume 1 per ward plus 3 in a float because the numbers are so bad. Some of the wards in Concord are 1,500 people, more populous than the smallest ward. And that just, I mean, that, you can't even do a simple-minded approach such as 1 per ward plus 3 in a float. That blows the deviations right there. Plus, as I said earlier, you can't just assume Concord is 13 reps and work around it because that causes problems with a number of the towns. I think we're going to have to assume the cities will do their duties in an appropriate way, because we don't really care where the ward lines are as long as the populations are equal and that we know where the contingent the connections are.
Thank you, Representative McGuire. My understanding is, and I'm not from a city, so I guess I'm going to look to Representative Bergeron for this. Can it be fair to assume that like a city like Manchester or Merrimack, even though they're undergoing a revision, are going to probably keep the same number of wards?
Yes, because the number of wards are determined by their city charters. They would have to amend the city charter to change the number of wards.
Okay. So are there 1 or 2 cities who are thinking about getting rid of their wards?
Berlin does not have wards.
Okay, so that's a city.
And I heard that Franklin might also be looking to get rid of its wards.
Okay. So if we assumed that the cities did the right thing, our base math should be consistent, even if our lines have changed.
Yes, I think it's hopeful to assume that the cities will keep their population deviations within a range of 10% as they're doing their redistricting. The numbers that are currently out there obviously are skewed. I know in Nashua, for example, the southwestern ward has had a lot of residential development, so its population is going to be much higher than perhaps another part of the city in terms of increases. So that's got to be corrected. There's also one other thing I would note. I noticed in the case of Nashua that the census tract boundaries did not adhere to ward lines. So if we're looking at census tract numbers, we can't necessarily assume that those are true representations of what the actual population numbers are in the wards that those tracts sort of fall in. In other words, they're overlapping ward boundaries, and the cities will have to dig down to the block level or even neighborhood level to figure out where to plus and minus some of the population numbers.
All right, Representative Berry.
So, Madam Chairman, I just want to point out this is this is a big problem for multiple reasons. If we draw our state rep lines based upon the current lines as they are today, and then the cities go and redistribute their population appropriately as they should, our lines will then be out of whack. They will be out of balance. Conversely, if they don't redistrict them, there's going to be equal protection arguments made on the municipal level. If I'm a Ward 12 voter in Manchester and my ward lines don't change, I'm suing because I'm being underrepresented in City Hall. So we have to, as a committee, come to some sort of consensus or action as to what to do with these cities that are so far deviated from the ideal that it makes it impossible to do our job. We are in a catch-22 situation, right? If we draw it as they are now and they change, we draw unconstitutional maps. We have to assume, or in my opinion, we need to assume that they're going to do their job in time. They're going to keep the same number of ward lines, which, as Representative Bergeron said, I don't believe anybody has any intention of changing that because it's in their charter. But we have to kind of set our course that, in my opinion, that they're going to do the right thing. And if we don't do that, we will draw, by default, we will draw maps that will be unconstitutional.
Thank you, Representative Weber.
Thank you, and as kind of a follow-up, I mean, I really don't see that the alternative of using the current ward lines is an alternative at all, because they do have an obligation to equalize their wards as soon as the census data comes out, just as everybody else does. So I think that the only way we can proceed, and certainly the way we proceeded 10 years ago, is to figure out how many representatives each city gets, and then work on that basis for figuring out, letting them draw the ward lines without our looking at the current numbers, because one of the things we're pretty sure about is those have to change. Now, and I'm trying to remember how, I know how it happened. What did happen several times last time is that one or more wards, given their equal number of population, were combined with a town outside of the city and given more representatives, as the one Keene ward that's joined to the one Concord ward that's joined to Hopkinton, for example, and then has 3 for all of them. And that is not at all ideal for the cities, but I will point out that all of these arguments are somewhat circular, because just as it makes no sense to combine a city ward with a town that may have very different interests, it also, when we get to the smaller population counties and regions, just as we've already heard, it makes no sense to put together some of the other groupings that we've put together. But given that there isn't enough population to do it another way, you wind up, I mean, it really is a catch-22 situation, but I'm arguing for trying to figure out the numbers for each city and then hoping for the best with that.
Thank you, Representative Weber. I guess my position would be that we have a number of wards, and we should continue to use the same number of wards and simply assume the population per ward. And the reason I'm putting it like that is because I think that's a programming issue, and I want the program to be able to be changed to reflect that assumption. And then if the city lines change, the amendment to the bill that comes out of this committee is a lot easier if you're into meets and bounds, because then we can just change it for the ward lines to the extent they're specifically in the statutes, as compared to redoing maps, because now I have a different population that throws the deviations out. Representative Turcott. Representative Weber.
As a follow-up to your statement, we've never put the ward lines in.
Yeah, as soon as I said that, I realized it's in the city charter.
We've only used the wards 1 through 7 or 1 through 3, whatever.
That's the lawyer talking, the judge, hoping the judge has his head down and didn't really hear what you said and just moved on to your next point. All right. Anybody else on this? Oh, sorry, Representative Wilhelm.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think there's an assumption here that the wards are going to largely stay the same, and that the lines would just move to adjust for population. So,
well, I think the point is some of the wards, as they even existed last time, are so far skewed for equal population that there needs to be some change. But I think, as Representative Weber said to me in a conversation earlier this morning, I think we're all trying to say the same thing slightly differently. But I guess my point in having this discussion is that I need something done, because the program that is out there now doesn't match to anything that we're talking about right now. Right. Representative McGuire.
Yes, thank you. Regarding your point, Representative Wilhelm, it doesn't matter whether it's Ward 5 exactly that's going adjacent to Hopkinton. We know that the city of Concord touches the town of Hopkinton, and I'm sure that, you know, if we say that the westernmost ward is in the district, you know, they probably will make the number the same, but they've got to have a ward that touches Hopkinton. There's just no way around it.
Representative Wilhelm.
So long as it's contiguous, right? I mean, that's the
Right.
assumption that we're making.
And
Okay.
we're not moving the city boundaries at all. So all the towns that currently touch the city do touch the city.
Right. As a follow-up,
Representative Wilhelm.
I'm just, is there a deadline for cities to do their redistricting?
Well, if you look at the handout, the reality is we're not going to be really getting numbers until January.
Well, and so I wonder, I mean, I know that we're trying to get our work done here by November 18th. Should we explore the possibility of waiting until we've got the city data back? And
The chair would not entertain such a motion because the issue is that we as a body have certain obligations and we will be voting on things in January. Even if the cities all take care of everything in January 1st, which I don't anticipate will be done. I don't know when our first session is to redo boundaries. So the process is this bill will come forward in the House. And people who have been on this committee before can add to it, but I know that bills will come out and are voted on by the House in January will be going to the Senate. So if there are further amendments or changes that need to be made, both chambers will have an opportunity. Representative Weber.
I'm not remembering precisely, but I do remember that we had this timing issue before. We did, of course, get the census numbers far earlier last time. But I'm thinking that we may have even had a rules suspension with respect to the work because it is necessary to have all of the data to produce a proper thing. So that might be something one might want to consider. And I had a further thought that has now escaped me. The other thing to bear in mind is just the issue that we have heard very clearly from the folks who have come to our listening session so far, that they would very much like an opportunity to have the same kind of commentary on maps once maps are issued. And if there were to be a rule suspension, that would allow for more deliberate comment from folks on actual maps. I know all of that's difficult, and I'm just putting that out there.
Representative McGuire.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I agree with Representative Weber that we do not want to delay the issuance of maps because the public has strongly said they want to comment on them. And I'm not willing to give out anything unless the wards are appropriate. So even if there is some tweaks later, we still want to say, okay, the cities have done their job properly. We have equalized wards. This is a plan that we're presenting for public comment. And I think that we want to do that as soon as possible.
Representative Steve Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think the place we're trying to get to is establishing a policy of how we're going to do the work, because if we assume that the wards are equalized, our software needs to be updated, and we use the software for two things: to create maps ourselves and to evaluate other maps that are brought to us. I would not like to have a lot of hours of work into that the way it stands now, because it does have the unequalized wards. So are we going to adopt a policy today?
Representative Weber.
And in the past, what we did to avoid, well, I don't know who had access to the software last time around because I certainly didn't. But my understanding was that what we did the last time around was we just left a black hole for the cities and did not try and force the current numbers that we have on the cities into the plan. We just left sort of a black hole for the cities, which meant that you didn't have to correct for all of the data. We just allocated X number to the city and worked around that until we got to the very end.
Representative Steve Smith.
Thank you. I'm not sure I understand how that works, because in order for you to do that work in that way, every city would have to be within an acceptable deviation of perfect population, and I don't believe that's true. And I'd like to get to the point where I can actually finish a county and move on. Can you clarify how that worked for me?
All right, well, all I know
don't
is that
know.
I thought I was in an algebra class, and then I heard about black holes, and now I'm in astronomy, so I think it's almost time for food. Representative Turcott.
Much like my comments on when we were talking about the numbers of, that we're going to use, the 400, it's the same thing as Representative Steve Smith has just said. In order to get going on our work, we need to know those numbers. Attempting to draw these districts with the wards as unbalanced as they are, I've run into that in several counties. It's just basically spinning wheels. The other concern I have, it's been mentioned that maybe waiting is, for the cities and town or cities to do their work. To me, waiting is not an option. Intentionally or unintentionally, having a city or a couple cities delay the process that we're trying to get accomplished, to me, is not an option. So I think we need to make a decision one way or the other on how we are going to treat those cities with wards.
Representative Bergeron.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I believe Representatives Smith, Weber, and Turcott are pretty much all on the same page, and I would second what Representative Weber said. 10 years ago, I was city clerk in Nashua and had conversations with Representative Valancourt, who was assisting in redistricting back then. And his direction to me was Nashua should just go ahead with its redistricting process, stay within the range of deviation, and the state would take care of the assignment of appropriate state rep seats or districts. And so I think what I'm hearing most people saying, and I apologize if I'm putting words in their mouths, is that we essentially say that city X is going to get so many state representatives, let them do their, and make the assumption that if, in the case of Nashua, we have 90,000 residents, 9 wards, and that Nashua will put 10,000 residents in each of those wards. And so for purposes of our software, we just look at the number of wards the city has, divide it by the number of into the population, and that's the number we put into our software as being the population for each of the wards, regardless of what it is actually now. That's the goal for what it should be after redistricting is completed.
Representative Ross. Barry.
To repeat what Representative Bergeron said, I think that's the way we have to go forward, is we have to assume that these cities are going to do their job. And I think we have to assume that they're going to do a near perfect job. I think we have to, as he said, take, in Manchester we have 12 wards, it's 115,000 people, 115,000 divided by 12, distribute that over the different wards, put that in the software, and draw our lines based off of that. That would be the process I think we have to follow. I don't see another path that doesn't end up with us getting maps tossed out.
Representative Weber. Representative Weber.
Thank you. And to follow up on all of that, and also to circle back to Representative Stephen Smith's question, we know if we take the approach that was just set out, we know what the deviation, both in population and in percentage, is in the allocation made to the city. And we can take into account that deviation when we're thinking about what combinations we might want to make or not want to make outside of the city. Just as Representative Wilhelm explained, it doesn't matter exactly where the lot line is if you know you have one equal slice of the pie plus a particular deviation. You can then work out what you do with it to fix the numbers overall.
Okay, thank you. I think we've sort of, we're actually sort of as a committee all agreeing that we're all saying the same thing, which I still can't quite figure out, but if we're there, we're there. Representative McGuire.
Yes, thank you. In full agreement with what's been said, I move that the chair direct our staff to assign equal numbers of population to each ward in each city so that we can proceed with our mapping, and that we send a letter to the cities telling them we are assuming they will do their job appropriately.
Is there a second? been seconded by Representative Turcott. Is there any further discussion on the motion? Representative Turcott.
Yes, Madam Chair, I'd just like clarification on Rep. Bergeron's chart where, regarding Franklin. What are we assuming there? Are we assuming the districts remain? Are we, because it could make a difference. So I would just like to have that clarified.
I think we need to treat every city the same at this time.
My understanding is Franklin, at least from what maybe Representative Bergeron can expound on this, is they're leaving their ward lines, but they're requesting to be treated as one.
Correct.
I don't know if that's legal, because
I mean, that's my position is we need to treat every city
Yeah.
the same at this
Yes.
point, which is what legally exists.
Because
at
we
this point in
we have
time.
a standard of political subdivision, and that's a political subdivision that exists inside the city of Franklin.
Yes,
That's-
if they succeed in eliminating their ward lines, that's one thing. But as long as they have them, we have to assume that all 3 wards have the same population.
And that might require a little more adjustment afterwards, depending on what they're doing, but I think as we proceed, everything, at least, it's my hope it's treated the same. Representative Marjorie Smith.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Could you help me understand how we would handle the situation such as the one that we have in Dover and Hopkinton? There's a similar situation, I mean, Concord and Hopkinton, there's a similar situation with Dover and Somersworth or Rollinsford, where we have to bring in a town in order to help make these numbers work. Does what we're proposing now in any way make it more or less difficult for us to do that combination? And it is, this is not a rhetorical question. I really don't understand and wonder how that would be handled.
Representative McGuire.
Yes, thank you. It would make such a process easier. Rollinsford is worth 3/4 of a rep, and therefore it needs to be joined with an adjacent town. It is actually only adjacent to the 2 cities of Somersworth and Dover, so it needs to be attached to some section of them, and knowing what the population of the wards are will make it much easier to do an appropriate redistricting in that area.
Representative Barry.
I just want to second what Representative McGuire says. I take one issue with the word. I don't know if easier or harder is the right word. I think accurate would be the right word.
Thank you. Further discussion on the motion?
Can I just
Representative Lynn.
Can I just ask one question? There were, if I understood correctly from the discussion, there are some cities that have at-large, in other words, they have wards and they also have an at-large, a ward that consists of an at-large, in other words, the whole city. Is that correct or
That
not
might
correct?
have to do with the city government, Representative Bergeron.
I know that Claremont is an example of that. They have 4 state representatives currently. They have 3 wards, so they elect 1 from each of the wards and 1 citywide. So it would be an at-large.
And I guess my only question is, what is the impact of that on what we have to do?
That's why you open your program and figure out where the reps are. Representative Steve Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Representative Lynn, for asking that question, because it's the best example of why this needs to be done. Claremont lost a boatload of people out of Ward 3, which created a massive deviation between that ward and Wards 1 and 2. Right now, when you give each of the 3 wards its own representative and then create the citywide flotarial, when they're equalized, the deviation is about 3.3. Without doing that, the deviation is just under plus 10 all by itself. Because of the geography of the county, there are necessary deviations that are -3 to -5. So if we don't do this, Claremont needs to be ripped up and have the wards combined with towns in order to create legal districts. I don't want that, and I don't think anybody does. So that's why we need to move forward with equalized numbers.
Any further discussion on the motion? I'm seeing none, so I'm going to ask the clerk to call the roll.
Representative Stephen Smith.
Yes.
Representative Carol McGuire.
Yes.
Representative Turcott.
Yes.
Representative McDonald votes yes. Representative Lynn.
Yes.
Representative Barry.
Yes.
Representative Alexander.
Yes.
Representative Simpson.
Yes.
Representative Marjorie Smith.
Yes.
Representative Bergeron.
Yes.
Representative Lane.
Yes.
Representative Piedra. Representative Weber.
Yes?
Representative Wilhelm.
Yes.
Representative Griffin.
Yes.
Unanimous, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you to committee members. We will do that. So what I will be looking for is for staff to make arrangements for an updated programs for you to use. I will ask them about the possibility of producing something alternative to a thumb drive. I have no idea about the ability to do that. And what I would like to do is to have an email sent to you when they are ready, so you can then respond to let us know whether you want it mailed or you will be picking it up because you're here on other legislative business. We had an instance where a thumb drive was mailed and it didn't get to where it was supposed to go, so if people are available to pick it up and would rather do that, I want to do that. We do have county listening sessions dates set up for all but 2 counties. Tonight needed to be canceled because it needs to be rescheduled. And the rescheduling is requiring a location change, which we are working on. Belknap, I believe, has been tentatively scheduled for the 19th, but there's some administrative things to make sure that we can secure the location, which is proposed to be the Mills. And as soon as that is definite, you will be informed. So we will be having listening sessions through mid-October, which was, I think, the stated goal at the beginning of those sessions. Representative Marjorie Smith.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I would like to also thank you for having to jump through incredible number of hoops to get the 10 listening sessions set up, and I know it wasn't easy, and I know the burden for that fell on the House, and I particularly want to thank you for that. Now, don't want to get you annoyed, because I really do appreciate all that you've done, but I also would like us to find a time, sooner rather than later, when we might talk about other factors that we believe are essential if we are going to do the best job that we can possibly do. I alluded to one earlier that was based, I think, on incredibly strong and persuasive testimony that we heard in the 3 counties, and that had to do with when we move to combine towns, that we consider, I think the euphemism is communities of interest, but one in particular to me stood out, and that was school districts. And I would hope that we might want to, and that would be probably high school districts rather than, the local elementary schools. I hope that we might give some consideration to including that in our decision-making, and I don't know how you might want to proceed about that. And again, I am serious in thanking you for the incredible work that you've done.
Thank you very much for your kind comments, and thank you to Representative Smith. She is one of the representatives that has attended all the public input sessions so far, along with a couple of other members. So thank you for that. It is my hope that we just had a fairly long discussion on a couple of pretty specific things. The number of representatives and allocating population in a city. It is my hope that if we have discussions about non-legislated parameters for districting, that it's done with the presentation of maps. I will tell you as chair, I am not really particularly, while I am having public input sessions to hear input about things, but I think ultimately this committee needs to get to what its task is, which is looking at maps. So what I would expect that if people are particularly concerned about various factors such as school districts, that I would see that in the presentation of maps to the committee for review by other committee members. So we'll be scheduling meetings as soon as I have some sort of a schedule. Of course, it will be put on the website and committee members will be informed. I have November 18th at the end of our agenda because that is indeed the date I understand is the report out date. So we will be proceeding on that, and I look forward to everybody's discussion while we're looking at maps on those other parameters. That's all I had for today's meeting. Is there any other business that people would like to bring? I saw somebody point across the table, so I'm going over here. Representative Lane.
Yes, thank you. At least at the meetings that I've attended thus far, it's apparent that people want more meetings once we agree on a map. And should we start scheduling those, or do we wait until we have a map and then schedule them?
I don't know. I'll have to make that decision because, as you may know from attending those, when I make decisions, it seems like the Senate then makes decisions. So I need to figure out how that's going to happen.
That, may I follow up?
Sure.
Without getting the other side of the wall mad at me, these are our hearings that we're scheduling, and if they need them to schedule their own, then I would suggest politely that they may want to do so.
I understand that, but I will also tell people that we have been at a public hearing where somebody insisted that we should be going to every town with a map. So I say that so we can all keep in mind we're dealing with a big spectrum of what people think is fair, appropriate, and should go forward. What I know needs to go forward are maps, so I'm hoping we're going to start getting to that pretty soon. I want to thank you all for coming today. I want to thank Mr. Andrews for coming and sticking through the rest of our meeting after he was on the agenda. And have a great day, everybody. Thank you.